Great. Okay, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Tomer Persico. I am on the faculty here at Brandeis of NEJUS, the Department of Near Eastern Judaic Studies, and more to the point today on the faculty of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, the sponsor of this seminar, which is our last seminar of this year. Also with us, I'm glad to see Professor Jonathan Sarna, the director of the Schusterman Center, and my wonderful colleagues, Risa Singer, Wendy Schwartz, and of course, Anna Simpson, without whom absolutely none of this would be possible. So thank you, Anna, and everyone for doing such great work under such unexpected circumstances. We won't really be going around the room to introduce everyone, but I will say that with us here are first and foremost our students, graduate and undergraduate students, and the rule of the Schusterman seminar is that the students get to ask the first rounds of questions. So that's how we will do it. And with us are other faculty and friends of Brandeis and participants in our fellowship programs and so forth of the past, and also hopefully still as we see going on in the future. And so without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenter today. We're delighted that he's able to join us and that you all can make it, however, virtually. Again, I'll be reading it from my phone because, as I mentioned earlier, my daughter has taken control of our printer today. So, Dr. Tomer Persico. Tomer Persico is currently in California. He's the Shalom Hartman Institute Bay Area Scholar in Residence, as well as a Koret visiting assistant professor of Jewish and Israel Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. That's just how we got him into the United States for now. He's taught for 8 years at the Department of Comparative Religion in Tel-Aviv University. His fields of study are contemporary spirituality, Jewish renewal, forms of secularization, and trends of secularization, religiosity in Israel in particular. His book, The Jewish Meditative Tradition, was published by Tel-Aviv University Press in 2016. Also, I'm delighted to recall when he presented for Brandeis at a Brandeis conference in India that we did a few years ago. That was great. He's also a public intellectual. He has emerged in recent years, Tomer, as one of the leading public intellectuals of the younger generation of public intellectuals in Israel, and he's he is an activist as well. He's an activist for freedom of religion in Israel, and has written literally hundreds of articles on these subjects for the popular media, and is always a pleasure to read and to hear from. And so Tomer will be presenting to us today on Jewish nationalism in the Temple Mount, the end point of Zionism. We couldn't be more pleased that you're here for this, our final seminar of the year. And so, please. Oh, and one last question. If people have questions, please write them on Zoom as the group chat. And so we'll be able to gather them together and create a good conversation going as best we can. And we will be done by 1 o'clock. Thank you.
Yehuda, thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm so happy to be here. And I'm glad all of you could join me from wherever you are. As Yehuda said, I'm going to talk about Jewish nationalism, the end point of Zionism. But I will begin happily with President Trump. And I will mention that in his 500-word speech about moving the US Embassy to Jerusalem, that was December 9, 2017, in that short speech, he twice mentioned that the status quo on the Temple Mount has to remain as it is. So he took notice to underline that in his very short speech. And that was no coincidence, of course. I don't believe he himself orchestrated it, but whoever advised him gave him good advice, because the Temple Mount has, over the last, I would say, 15 years, become a hotspot for tensions in Israel. Now, obviously, the Temple Mount has been contested for, what, 3,000 years, let's say, but the tensions have risen over the last 15 years because the state of Israel, and indeed specific groups inside the state of Israel, have made it their agenda to change the status quo on the Temple Mount, right? That has never been before, or certainly not in the magnitude that it is now. And I want to bring you a few quotes from MK's. Let me just share my, let's see if this works. Right, yeah. I wanted to bring a few quotes from Likud MKs about the Temple Mount. Look at this. Just to understand what's happening. Tzipi Chotoveli, this is from 2012. She was then the deputy foreign minister. The construction of the temple in its place on the Temple Mount should symbolize the renewal of the sovereignty of the people of Israel in its land. Gila Gamliel, then the minister for elderly. The temple is the people of Israel's ID card. We are the temple. It's the nation of Israel's direct contact with the divine. It's our right over this land, etc. Yuli Edelstein, today the head of Knesset, the chairman of the Knesset. My job is to engage in the daily process that unites and builds the people of Israel and that leads to the temple, etc., etc. Now, I've got another quote from Yuval Levin here, but as you can see, I couldn't find quotes after 2014, and that's for a simple reason. In summer 2014, as in summer 2015, we had cycles of violence in Israel that were that had a lot to do with the tensions in the Temple Mount. And Netanyahu told his members of his coalition to shut their mouth about going to the Temple Mount or the connection of the Jewish people to the Temple Mount. But these quotes, nevertheless, are very emblematic of what's happening over the last 15 years in Israel. You might say, well, weren't this always the case? Weren't Jews always interested in the Temple Mount? Weren't Zionists always thinking about the Temple Mount as a focal point of identity, of nationalism, etc.? And my answer would be no. They did not, and this was not always the case. And I want to bring here, as an example, a fantastic quote, I think, from David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister. This is 1937. And Ben-Gurion here expresses his views after the conclusion of the Peel committee that decided to internationalize Jerusalem instead of splitting it up. And Ben-Gurion says, to this day, I see a great tragedy in the lack of division of Jerusalem into two separate municipalities. Our situation in Jerusalem is completely different now, and perhaps our political fate in our immediate future would have changed fundamentally had we understood and dared to divide Jerusalem. To our woes, the patriotic cliché triumphed in Jerusalem, the barren, empty, idiotic cliché over the creative national exploit. And Jerusalem is now unified under the rule of the Nashashibis and the Chaldeans, a Jewish Jerusalem free of controlling, emasculating partnership of the Arab Effendi and of the British clerk, cut off from the old city, which is hopeless, save from being turned into a cultural, spiritual museum of all faith, and exempt from the Arab neighborhoods that drain our power, would have energized our creative talent, centered our funds and strengths, but the idle cliché was stronger. Now, this is Ben-Gurion in 1937. Granted, he warmed up to the idea of Jerusalem in the 40s, but it represents the basic attitude of secular socialist Zionism towards the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount, the whole of Eastern Jerusalem, the whole of the Holy Basin, is something that taps your strengths. It's something that you expand sources, resources on that you don't have, that you need for other things. Ben-Gurion would say we need to build a secular, socialist model society in Israel. We don't need this religious paraphernalia center, which, as he says, is hopeless except being turned into an international museum for all faith or whatever. That's the best thing we can do with it. Now, granted, Ben-Gurion, of course, was representative of, as I said, Mapai, labor movement, socialist, secular Zionism. There were other Zionists around, and in this presentation, what I really want to do is show how different strands of Zionism changed or developed their attitude towards the Temple Mount. And apart from socialist Zionism, at the beginning of the foundation and after the foundation of the State of Israel, we of course had revisionist Zionism and religious Zionism. Now I've made socialist Zionism a bit larger, but really it was quite a lot larger. It was the undisputed hegemony ruling uncontested, founding the State of Israel, ruling after the state was established for decades, really, and really also oppressing opposition quite illiberally, if we might say so. Then again, at least with religious Zionism, it didn't have much to oppress when we're talking about the Temple Mount. When we are concerned with the attitude towards the Temple Mount, socialist secular Zionism found a twin and parallel voice in religious Zionism and certainly in ultra-Orthodoxy. And I would like to show how that took place, and of course also direct our attention to revisionist Zionism and to what it had to contribute to this discussion. Now let's begin with socialist Zionism. Again, we read the quote from Ben-Gurion, and here is this is a famous quote from Altneuland, Herzl's novel about the fictional future Jewish autonomy or state in the land of Israel. This is the Frederick, the protagonist of the novel, studied the nature of the huge whitish gold building he is coming to Jerusalem in the distance, whose roof lay on marble pillars. Yes, a forest of columns with gold capitals was visible to them, and Frederick heard with a deep, exceptional shock as David said the word, "This is the temple." There were hotels here for pilgrims of all faith, the public institutes, hospitals, and hospitals of Christians, Muslims, and Jews stood side by side, but a vast square area was occupied by the magnificent Hall of Peace with its solemn demeanor, where international congresses of peace seekers and scholars of all branches of science would gather. The old city was a kind of internationalized space. Now this again reminds us very much of Ben-Gurion's conception. Really, if there is anything to do with the Holy Basin in the old city of Jerusalem, is internationalize it and make it into a center, a hub for all faith, for people of all different confessions, right? This attitude is secular, this attitude is scientific in it's certainly utilitarian. It has no sentiment for reviving any old sort of worship in the holy on the Temple Mount, in the temple, and it is not nationalist in a way that it gladly gives up control of East Jerusalem, of the Holy Basin. And this is again because from the point of view of secular Zionism, certainly also secular socialist Zionism that came after Herzl, the Holy Basin is a source of problems. It is a source of, it is something that will tap our energy, that will take our concentration, our energy away from the important projects that we need to commit to, which are building a secular socialist model society. Now this attitude, again, I want to suggest is not just Herzl, is not just Ben-Gurion, this is the mainstream left-wing socialist secular Zionism, and it goes until it survives in that way until 67 and even beyond. In 67, this is before the Six-Day War, Moshe Dayan, the Minister of Security at that time, he was reviewing the old city of Jerusalem with binoculars from afar before Israel sent the IDF and conquered / liberated East Jerusalem. And Moshe Dayan has to say, what do I need all this Vatican for? What? why do we need to concern ourselves with the Temple Mount and the Wailing Wall and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, etc.? We don't need it. So that's the basic classic secular, socialist, Zionist idea or attitude towards the Temple Mount. But of course, they were not alone, and they had at that time small siblings, which I mentioned before: revisionist Zionism, right-wing revisionist Zionism, and religious Zionism. But as I said, there was a comfortable parallel in views, at least pragmatically, about what to do with the Temple Mount, concerning with secular Zionism and religious Zionism. And here are some. Here is the basic attitude of religious Zionism. This is Rabbi Abraham Yitzchak Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel, and after 67, also the man whose texts would become the inspirational theology for the settler movement and really for all religious Zionism. I think Yehuda knows one or two things about Kook. And Kook here in 1914 comments about Baron Rothschild's visit to the Temple Mount. He says, "My heart aches for the desecration caused by being at the holy place of the temple, and more so for not being told that it is forbidden. A single defect in the sanctity of our holy abode is more costly than 1,000,000 townships." Right? So it's nice that Baron Rothschild is contributing a lot of money to build townships in the land of Israel for Jews, but really that is insignificant compared to the damage he did when he ascended the Temple Mount. That's how much Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Cohen Kook is opposed to ascending the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is off limits to Jews, right? And indeed, in the 20s, again, Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Cohen Kook, he was then the chief rabbi. He basically built the chief rabbinate in collaboration with the British, who were, of course, then controlling Israel. Lays out this sort of pamphlet or flyer, and I'm reading the English, right? A public warning by His Eminence, the Chief Rabbi of Eretz Israel, Avraham Yitzchak Kook. Our dear brethren who come from far and near to visit the holy city of Jerusalem, be warned and remember that it is strictly forbidden by Jewish law and religion to enter the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, or to ascend the Har Habayit. Okay? It's very clear. It's strictly forbidden to enter the Temple Mount and even to ascend enter the temple grounds and even to ascend the Temple Mount. This is a direct order from the chief rabbi. This was the attitude, and as I said, it was very comfortable for secular Zionism because both sections of the Zionist movement agreed that the Temple Mount is off limits. Either we're not interested in it, or we're very interested in it, but are forbidden to ascend. Now, I bring one more quote from religious Zionism just to, again, to understand the mindset. This is Zerach Verhaftig, a minister in the government in 67 from the religious Zionist party. And this is after the war, after the 6-day war in which Israel has already occupied East Jerusalem and of course much beyond. And he says in a radio interview, "I am thrilled that the halakha decrees that the third temple ought to be built by God. I am thrilled, as this means we are not entering into a struggle with the Muslim faith." So he expresses his joy. Fantastic, God forbids us from ascending the Temple Mount. We have to wait for divine intervention, and so we are not going to enter into conflict with the Muslim faith, with the Muslims who, of course, at that time, occupy the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, etc. You could not imagine a minister or parliament member, Knesset member from the religious Zionist party today expressing joy at the fact that we cannot build the third temple with our own hands, or much less that we are not going to go get into conflict with the Muslims there. Something fundamental has changed. And what has changed concerns the third strand of Zionism, of course, generally speaking, then the third strand of Zionism that then made up the Zionist movement in Israel, and that is revisionist Zionism. Revisionist Zionism always had a special place for the Holy Basin, for the Temple Mount, for the Wailing Wall. If we remember that the Herzl, the Irgun, organized shofar blowing in the at the foot of the Wailing Wall, contrary to British orders, by breaking the British mandate law, and by being very proud that they are blowing the shofar at the foot of the Wailing Wall, and thus claiming or reclaiming the Jewish connection there. And I bring here a sort of a constitution created by the Lehi, the even more extreme guerrilla terrorist organization of the revisionist right at before the establishment of the State of Israel. This is this was published consecutively in 2 years, 1941 and 1942. It's called Ikarei Atchiyah, the fundamentals of revival, and it of course includes many things needed for the revival of sovereignty, of Jewish nationalism, people and strength and education, etc., etc. But the last, but certainly not least, clause of this constitution talks about the Temple Mount. Clause 18, the house, the building of the third temple as a symbol of the days of complete redemption. And again, here we see the completely different attitude of revisionist Zionism opposing itself both to secular socialist Zionism and to religious Zionism. For revisionist Zionism, for right-wing Zionism, the Temple Mount and the Wailing Wall were always symbols of national strength. They were always centers of nationality around which the people would one day, as soon as possible, hopefully coalesce. They are taking these, they are taking the holy site, the traditional holy site of the Temple Mount, and making it into a national symbol. And again, the house, the building of the third temple is a symbol of a days of complete redemption, right? Redemption here is, of course, political sovereignty. And this again was not only before the State of Israel was founded, it continued after the state was founded. And I want to bring a quote from one of the major intellectuals of the revisionist right. This is 1951. The state is already founded, and I'm talking about Israel Eldad, a very prominent and prolific and actually brilliant thinker that articulated for a few decades the main worldview for revisionist or right-wing, extreme right Zionism in Israel. And this is from an article of his called The Desolate Temple Mount, 1951. And Eldad says such, I'm reading, "This is the foundation stone of our world. We are bound for sacrifice upon it. We exist upon it. Whoever thinks the temple is a matter of religious worship and as such under the jurisdiction of a ministry of religious services has not grasped the essence of the thing called the people of Israel in the world. The temple cannot be some nicer Yeshurun that could also be in New York. The link of the temple to the geopolitical and historical point called the Temple Mount is what symbolizes the special essence of our worldview." Right? And here I think everything is encapsulated neatly and very articulately. The Temple Mount, it's not a religious thing at all. Don't think it's like just a big synagogue, right? It's not another Jeshurun like in New York. It is a symbol or a manifestation of our geopolitical situation in the world. It is the epicenter of our manifest destiny in the land of Israel and in the whole world, really generally. The Temple Mount here again is taken as a national symbol, and this is what is, I think, important to underline. For these people, the temple, even if built, will not be a religious center. Yes, maybe animals will be sacrificed on it, or people will pray on it, or whatever. That doesn't interest them, or at least it's not the most important thing for them. For them, what's fundamental about the Temple Mount is that it is a central, coalescing national institute, and they take the Temple Mount as a springboard for the revival of Jewish nationalism in the land of Israel. Now, I don't know if Eldad was referring to Congregation Keilat Jeshurun in Manhattan or Congregation Bnei Jeshurun. It doesn't really matter. What I want now to do is to broaden the picture a bit and to talk about the Temple Mount, because after presenting the general views of the three major Zionist strands in Israel, at least until 30 or 40 years ago, I want to talk about a little bit about the Temple Mount itself, the ordinances and the traditions connected to it, and see how they form the background, the backdrop for what we just said. Now, I've brought here diagrams of the Temple Mount, of Haram el-Sharif, El-Aqsa. You have the Dome of the Rock there in the center, the octagonal shaped building. And this, and on the left, you can see a diagram of the second larger Herodian Beit Mikdash temple. And I want to assume that I made this to scale. I mean, that this is how the temple is proportioned with the Temple Mount. And I want to try to understand what really what are the relations between them. Now, as you must know, when the temple was built, was erected, obviously it was carefully regulated. You couldn't simply walk in, or there were different grades of different spaces in the temple that different classes of people could walk into or not walk into. The most holy, the Holy of Holies, of course, was opened only once a year for the high priest in Yom Kippur, etc. But after the temple is destroyed, and the temple, as you know, was destroyed in 70 AD. After the temple is destroyed, can we simply go and see the ruins, right? And walk around and pray on the old side of the temple? Why, or in other words, why was religious Zionism so adamant in its opposition to ascending the Temple Mount? So I want to begin with a quote from Maimonides, who tells us that even though the temple is now in ruin because of our sins, a person must hold its side in awe as one would regard it when it was standing. Okay, so this is a general decree. It's not that because the temple was destroyed, you can simply waltz in and take a tour of the ruins. Indeed, Rabbi Meir Cohen of Radin, the Chafetz Chaim, a very important posek, tells us that one who enters now into the place of the temple sins a mortal sin, Koret, as we are all defiled by the defilement of death. So this is halachically substantiated. It's based on purity and defilement codes. We are not allowed to go into the temple. But wait a minute. As we seen before, the temple is much smaller than the Temple Mount. Let's say we're not allowed to go into the temple grounds. Why can't we simply walk on the Temple Mount, not inside the temple? So to answer that question, so Jews theoretically can ascend the Temple Mount, can tour the site around the temple, but not enter where the ruined temple once stood, right? Why can't they do that? And to understand that, I've brought a nice quote by Rabbi Shlomo Aviner, a contemporary religious Zionist rabbi, and he explains this quite clearly. So he's asked, what is the opinion of Rabbi in relation to the ascending the Temple Mount? And he says, answer, I have no personal opinion. My personal opinion does not count. It's a question of Greater Israel, which is decided by our great rabbis. And indeed, almost all great rabbis, ultra-Orthodox and religious Zionists, prohibit it. And why? According to the halakha, a person will be allowed to enter the Temple Mount except for the Azara and the Chayil. It's the outer perimeter. The problem is we do not know where exactly the Azara and the Chayil are. There are many measurements set on the basis of the place of the western wall, the southern wall, the foundation stone, etc. There are different methods that contradict each other. So that in fact, everything is shrouded in mystery. Therefore, the ancient custom of Jerusalem is that we do not enter. So Rabbi Shlomo Aviner explains to us why even ascension to the Temple Mount is prohibited. Yes, we can. Theoretically, we could simply avoid the place of the temple, but we don't know where the temple fits in the Temple Mount. Is it on the top, at the bottom, north, south, diagonal, horizontal or vertical, etc. But I want to make this a bit more complicated. I think that the real reason is not the technical knowledge of where the temple exactly was. It's a specific attitude that makes traditional Jews apprehensive or even very much opposed to ascending the Temple Mount. And this attitude, I think, can be found in this quote again from Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Kohen Kook. And I want to read it and try to understand. Chazal, our sages, saw that we should sanctify the temple so that the supreme fear of Mora Mikdash, fear of the temple, will be instilled in us. And it is exactly by being far that this fear will be planted in the heart. We know that the feeling of sanctity and honor is established by exclusion and denial of approximation. Thus also by refraining from approaching when we are unpure to the holy place, we observe the commandment of Mora Mikdash. And this is more precious than the same fear that comes by proximity, when we are not worthy of it. So Rabbi Avraham Kohen Kook mentions the defilement thing, but he says really the reason that we are not ascending the Temple Mount is to maintain distance. And distance establishes in us a sentiment, the proper sentiment of Mora Mikdash, of fear of the temple. This is the important thing. It's a very basic attitude that if something is holy, we don't go near it. If something is sacred, we stay away. We look upon it with fear and awe. We don't touch it. We certainly don't manipulate it. And this, I want to suggest, is the basic attitude of religious Zionism, of course, of ultra-Orthodoxy also, that made it very easy for it to cooperate and vice versa with secular Zionism in pragmatically avoiding anything to do with the temple. This is the basic attitude, and by the way, it totally aligns with the Durkheimian definition of holy. I've brought here the Émile Durkheim, a secular French Jew from the beginning of the 20th century, one of the fathers of sociology. I brought here his definition of religion, but in it we can find what is important to us, his definition of the sacred. A religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things. That is to say, things set apart and forbidden. Beliefs and practices which unite into a single moral community called the church, all those who adhere to them. And here Durkheim gives us exactly the sentiment that Kook is talking about. Things that are sacred for us are things set apart and forbidden. The Sabbath is sacred because it is a special day and forbidden to act on it in certain ways, right? When a groom tells his bride in a Jewish wedding, "Harei at mekudeshet li, harei at mekudeshet li," she is sanctified to him because she is set apart and forbidden to others. This is the very simple meaning of the word kadosh, sacred or holy in Hebrew. And indeed, and you can see it also in this nice quote I've brought from Exodus just before the receiving the Torah. Passover is near, so it's even relevant. Moses says to the Lord, "The people cannot come up Mount Sinai because you yourself warned us. Put limits around the mountain and set it apart as holy." It's like Moses and the divine read Durkheim and implemented what he says, right? Set it up, put limits around the mountain, set it apart as holy. The holy is what is set apart. And this again, as I said, this is what Cook is talking about here. And this is the basic attitude of traditional Judaism, ultra-Orthodoxy, and religious Zionism concerning the Temple Mount. It is so holy that we don't go near it. This is another quote that fleshes this out, but I don't know how much time I have, and I wonder. Okay, but it's so nice that I want to read it to you. Please bear with me. This is Rabbi Tzvi Tau, today an important leader, or the important leader of the Chardal, the more extreme nationalist, religious Zionists who have taken upon ultra-Orthodoxy worldview. And he here is talking to members of the Jewish underground caught in the beginning of the 80s, planning to, among other things, blow up the Dome of the Rock. And he says, where God is concerned, closeness is achieved by distance. And it is also true of these matters. We do not reveal our ownership of the Temple Mount by actually stepping there. Contrarily, our ownership is manifested in the fact that the Gentiles are stepping there and not us. Our entering there will arouse divine accusations and will not drive them away. It will be like striving to bring Messiah before the right time. It is a central point in our faith to distinguish between the people of Israel worthy of the temple and the people of Israel today. Those who fail to see this decrease the matter and reduce it to the level of kindergarten. The Temple Mount is not a private matter for leaping ahead, etc., 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 etc. Right? The attitude is clear. The Temple Mount is holy because we do not approach it, and vice versa. We do not approach it because it's holy. Now, this was the attitude of religious Zionism in Israel till maybe 15 years ago. And I can bring you a quote even from 91, an explicit quote. This is by Rabbi Menachem Fruman writing in Haaretz, and this is a sort of an open letter that Fruman is writing to the Palestinians, by the way. But he lays out what he claims is the religious Zionist attitude towards the Temple Mount, right? He says the national religious public concept consists of two very forceful elements: a very realistic materializing one, the actual settlement of the entire Eretz Israel, and a messianic spiritual one, objection to entering the Temple Mount. The messianic element is perceived from an Orthodox point of view, waiting silent for the Messiah, not creating a false Messiah by our own hands. The holiness of the Temple Mount is expressed not by barging into it, but rather by withdrawing from it. Rabbi Fruman is not the average or classic religious Zionist, but I think he's representing correctly the average and classic religious Zionist attitude towards the Temple Mount, at least until 15 years ago. And indeed, this attitude started to change in 1996. This is the first time, 1996, the first time that a major group of rabbis decreed that ascension to the Temple Mount is allowed. And this is from the Yesha Rabbinical Council. And they are saying, we call any rabbi who holds that the ascent to the Temple Mount is allowed to ascend himself or to instruct his congregation how to ascend according to the halakha. For it is a disgrace to us that the Arabs that say, let us take possession of the patrons of God, they ascend in the tens of thousands, while we do not ascend even one of a city and two from a family. The attitude is changing here really before our eyes. In 1991, Rabbi Fruman could say it is not allowed, our attitude, we can actually, you can relax, Palestinians, we actually don't want the Temple Mount right now. This is what he's saying to them. We have an argument about the settlements, but don't worry about the Temple Mount. Here, something is changing. And something is changing, of course, not by chance. First of all, these rabbis clearly, explicitly say why they are changing the attitude, right? Because for it is a disgrace that the Arabs ascend in tens of thousands when we do not. That's it. They are there and we're not. Of course, also, this is February 96. The Oslo process is full steam ahead, right? Rabin has been assassinated, but Peres is the prime minister, soon to be replaced by Netanyahu's first rise to power. But anyway, the Oslo Accords are very much alive, and these rabbis are frightened, are concerned that in the future negotiations between the Israel and the Palestinians, the Temple Mount will be on the table and maybe change hands. Attitude change, halakha changes, and something happens. And indeed, something happens in such a magnitude that 20 years later, by 2014, we can have a survey among religious Zionist public that says, in a survey conducted May 2014, 75% said that they favored the ascent of Jews to the Temple Mount compared to 24% against. This is a complete revolution in attitude, right? When asked what are the reasons on which to base oneself when it comes to Jews going up the Temple Mount of classical religious Zionism, 39% said that the ascent is needed in order to witness the special site. 54% thought that a visit should be made in order to carry out a positive commandment, mitzvah aseh, and a prayer at the site. 58% claimed that the ascent will raise awareness about the temple and its meaning. And a full 96% said that visiting the site would constitute a contribution to strengthening Israeli sovereignty in the holy place. And when we are talking about the change of attitude in the religious Zionist camp, we, I think, need to consider that last piece of data. The fact that the majority, even to say consensus is putting it mildly, in religious Zionism, is that ascending the Temple Mount is for strengthening Israeli sovereignty on the Temple Mount. This should tell us quite a lot. The change of attitude of religious Zionism concerning the Temple Mount comes from a change of attitude about what we need the Temple Mount for. It is no longer a worshipful religious site in the narrow sense that the Temple Mount is for, practicing a mitzvah aseh, prayer, etc. The Temple Mount is used to strengthen sovereignty of Israel. And indeed, you can hear it all along what right-wing members of Knesset say about the Temple Mount, especially religious ones. And I've brought this quote from Tzvi Chotoveli, but look at it in eyes now, knowing what kind of change of attitude of religious Zionism took place. Chotoveli says, right, it should symbolize the renewal of sovereignty of people of Israel in its land. And Chotoveli is a practicing Orthodox Jew. Yehuda Glick, another. He's no longer a member of Knesset, but he was. Each must take it upon itself to take over the Temple Mount. Control of the Temple Mount makes us great, gives us power, draws us closer to God. Feiglin, a very interesting, used to be in the Likud. Today he's independent. He's not in Knesset right now, but he's a religious Orthodox Jew. He says, it's not a religious thing. It's about sovereignty. We are here on the Temple Mount on a national mission. Each Jew that goes up the mountain, every single Jewish foot stubbornly ascending the Temple Mount, reclaims Israel's sovereignty not only on the mountain, but on our whole land. The menorah, the symbol of the state of Israel, will return in our day to illuminate our temple, God willing. And finally, Bezalel Smotrich, today the Minister of Transportation, says I will, God willing, ascend the Temple Mount when the ministers and the Knesset members will be able to ascend freely and upright for the realization of the sovereignty of the state of Israel on the Mount. These people are not talking about prayer, they're not talking about sacrifices, they're not talking about any religious worship, they're not talking about connecting to the divine in any worshipful manner. They are talking about Israeli sovereignty on the Temple Mount. This is what's important. And really, if we go back to the different strands of Zionism that made up Israeli Jewish society, or at least its Zionist parts, since the establishment of the State of Israel, if once in the beginning of the state's existence, we had socialist Zionism, secular socialist Zionism, basically the undisputed hegemony and wanting nothing to do with the Temple Mount, and we had religious Zionism basically collaborating with a Mapainik labor movement, a socialist secular Zionism, also wanting nothing to do with the Temple Mount. This is for the days of the Messiah, and only revisionist Zionism taking the Temple Mount as a symbol of national power, as a symbol of sovereignty. We see today that the attitude of revisionist Zionism has become the consensus among the Israeli right-wing Zionism. And the picture that we can paint today is that we have a small progressive Zionist camp, which are basically the descendants or the remnants of what once was secular socialist Zionism. This is today's Labor Party, which it's like 2 seats in parliament now, or 3. That's its merits, etc., which still adhere to this distancing from the Temple Mount. But on the other side, we have nationalist or ethno-nationalist Zionism, both from what once was revisionist Zionism, and it's not the same as nationalist, ethno-nationalist Zionism, and also with religious Zionism. And it's not a mistake that I wrote nationalist Zionism also there, because really, in many ways, religious Zionism in Israel today is much more nationalist than it is religious. The importance of Jewish sovereignty, Jewish power, the existence of the Jewish state is for many, I would say for most, more important than halachic observance and traditional commitment. And when we have this picture, we can understand how today the Temple Mount has become such a hot spot, such a contested and intense spot, when both what once was revisionist right-wing Zionism and today is the Likud, etc., in the broader right-wing camp, and religious Zionism both see today the Temple Mount as the center or a symbol for national sovereignty. And right. I have a few more things to say about that transformation in religious Zionism, but I will open now for questions and maybe get to it if it is wanted.
Great.
So
Okay, well,
are you leading the?
Yes, I'm, and thank you so much. Now we have about 12 minutes left, and it's testament to the richness of your presentation that the chat has been on fire the last few minutes. Especially, and it's especially appropriate, I guess, for something in which the temple and the altar are at its heart to be on fire. I want to share with you first questions from our students before we get to larger questions. Mika, who's one of our doctoral students, was asking a little bit more about the poll that you cited from Motzash. You know, who did the poll? And crucially, she asks, are the politicians leading this or following this development?
Right. Okay, great.
And and similarly, one of our other doctoral students, Shira Malka Cohen, asks, how would this increasingly widespread understanding of the Temple Mount in nationalist terms influence, speaking of politicians, what influence might that have on Israeli politics going forward? If you please could speak to that, and then I'll put together some of the other questions we've been getting.
So let's look at the poll again. Just a second.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, I mean, the poll was organized by Mescar. You see, I mean, I wrote it in the top. I don't know that institute, but I don't think there's any need to doubt the numbers that they wrote here. That's the basic consensus today in religious Zionism. The Temple Mount or activity around the Temple Mount has become one of the main issues that are talked about, debated about, and indeed more and more legitimized by rabbis and public leaders of the religious Zionist camp. Now, are politicians following or leading? Basically following. We have to give credit to the many activists that organize ascensions to the Temple Mount and demonstrations. They know what they're doing. They're working very hard, but of course they couldn't succeed without a religious Zionist public that is open to hearing what they're saying like never before. It has to do also with what happened to Cookism. If we remember, right, we saw the explicit forbiddance by Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Cohen Cook of ascending the Temple Mount. His son, Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda, I didn't bring quotes, but I could have, also strictly forbid ascension to the Temple Mount. What happened? What happened to their legacy? What happened is that Cookism basically broke down. Cookism collapsed in a series of crises over the last 30, even 40 years. And today, what once was the overarching ideology for religious Zionism is no more. And in place of that paradigm, which was a hegemonic structure silencing other opinions, in place of that structure are new voices coming up. Mm-hmm. One of them, the Temple Mount, which also, I will just say, served as a replacement messianic goal after the building of settlements has turned out not to be fulfilling the redemptive.
Right. Well, actually, that leads very neatly into some of the other questions. Also, I would just say, I would take the privilege of answering a question that was asked in the chat about how these new generations of religious Zionists deal with the halachic arguments. And, they essentially just also in practical terms, they'll say, yes, when Maimonides says not to go someplace, he means specific areas. And thanks to modern archaeology, et cetera, we can go.
But Yehuda, this is the thing I want to emphasize. Halachic, technicalities can be solved. Right. There's always an excuse. What we need to do is try to understand the deeper, broader sentiment that has changed.
Yes.
Where once, for religious Zionism, it was clear that because the Temple Mount is so holy, we abstain from it, we step back. Today, holiness has moved to the side, and nationalism and sovereignty are center stage. And for nationalism, we need to step up.
For what it's worth, actually, I think you're absolutely right. Now, some of the questions we had, there was one question that was posed early on, the Kotel. Right, the Kotel, which sort of where is the Kotel in all this? What do you see the Kotel operating as a kind of a space in its own right here, or to what extent is it connected to Temple Mount, or is it?
So it's very interesting because obviously, the Kotel has undergone some depreciation in its value. I mean, if we are concentrated on the Temple Mount, what do we need the Kotel for? And where once the Kotel was the center, certainly for secular, but traditional, but also for religious Zionism, today you can hear actually people say, why are you bothering about that simple wall? We need the real thing. By the way, this also gives permission, gives leeway for pluralistic attitudes. Women of the wall, let them have the Kotel. Let them pray the way they want in the Kotel. We want the Temple Mount, and we don't care about the Kotel.
Okay, so now a question from one of our students. Again, I'm trying to move this quickly along. Leon Crime asks, one of our undergrads, can assent to the Temple Mount, religiously or otherwise, for the sake of national sovereignty, coexist, to these folks' mind, with a right of Muslim practice at the same time?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, some will say we have no problem with the Muslims. We will find some solution. But I think most don't think it can coexist. And some explicitly say the Dome of the Rock will have to go. I mean, it's just a matter of time before we go there with dynamite and bulldozers. So
or simply, as I mean, in my conversations with the Temple Mount faithful people, their plans are to sort of to move it the way you move like an archaeological site when you have to build.
Okay, these are the nice ones. Okay.
Right. Yeah, those are the nice ones that I talked to. But there were some other questions here, and again, I'm pulling together a few questions. The political dimension. What is the role of American evangelicals here? Are they simply supporting players, or do they have a key role here? What exactly has been the role?
I have here
Donald Trump in all of this.
I have here something. Look at this. This is a coin issued by an organization that, of course, this is the temple, and here you see Trump and Cyrus. Okay, this was issued. This is gold-plated, issued after Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem, portraying Trump as the new Cyrus.
Right.
And when I talked to Professor Hillel Cohen, and not Hillel.
Yeah, Hillel Cohen.
Yeah, Hillel Cohen. Okay. From this institute, he says the majority of these coins were sold to U.S. evangelicals, okay? Not to Israelis, not to Jewish Israelis. Why? And yeah, that connection is very strong. Both messianic movements, you can say, are looking forward to building the third temple. Of course, the end point is a bit different. For the Jews, it's Messiah, and for the Christians, it will be the Antichrist, which officiates sacrifices in the temple and then brings on the Armageddon. But as of now, they can cooperate, and they are cooperating beautifully. There are many mutual projects and a lot of donations. So indeed, and these are people who are whispering in Trump's ear. I mean, John Hagee, Pastor John Hagee, has explicitly said that he told Trump to move the embassy for him to be written in history as the new Cyrus. And this is John Hagee, who a few years ago published a book named Jerusalem Armageddon. Something I maybe, but these words.
A friend of mine who was at the embassy ceremony said that it was surreal. He said it was like a bar mitzvah in Great Neck, but all the Torah sermons were being given by evangelicals. But to return to something that a few people have asked about, the place of redemption, right? So classic religious Zionist thought, I mean, classic a la Kook, was that Zionism as part of some sort of redemptive process. Is this still about redemption, or is this still about something else? And a related question that folks have asked are, how are ultra-Orthodox Jews, the Haredim, responding to all of this?
Okay, great. The question of redemption is a bit complicated. I would say first, in simple terms, no, it's not about redemption for most religious Zionists today. Indeed, most religious Zionists today are not messianic, right, in a way that they are waiting for an imminent return or imminent.
And this is just to strengthen, just to tighten the point that you were making about after the Gaza disengagement.
Right. Messianism has fallen. Cookism has fractured. It's they no longer have that hope. So for most religious Zionism, the Temple Mount is about nationalism, is about sovereignty, is about Jewish power. For some, it does make a replacement messianic goal after the settlements project has proven a failure, or at least something that can be botched, we can withdraw, etc.
And those are, and again, speaking, because I'm trying to integrate as many questions as we got, those would be the folks who are sort of like running the temple, the institutes where they write, legal tracts about how to run a temple and how to build.
Exactly. And we need to make clear, most religious Zionists are not planning on building the third temple the next week or something. They are interested in Jewish sovereignty. A minority of them, a group that indeed exists and it's very active, but it's a minority, it's a small minority, is planning on third temple project.
Right. So, Tomer, we have about a minute left. And what's sort of like the one key thought with which you'd like to leave us that also helps us make sense of this historical moment and Israeli politics moving forward in the light of this? And what does this say about the interplay of religion and nationalism in our time?
You know, I'll end with a quote by Gershom Scholem, right? And this is the quote. Oi. Right. Sholem says, this is 1960, whether or not Jewish history will be able to endure this entry into the concrete realm without perishing in the crisis of the messianic claim which has virtually been conjured up from its depth, that is the question that out of its great and dangerous past, the Jew of this age poses to his present and to his future. Judaism has entered into history via secular Zionism. Secular Zionism made Judaism again a nation, a part of the family of nations, an agent in history, someone that makes history and not someone that history is made on their back. But the question is the entry into history going to conjure up these messianic forces that actually want to displace history and to get Judaism out of history again into some metaphysical, meta-historical vision? That's the question. Can Judaism today keep at bay those forces that want to basically turn the Zionist project on its head and expunge Judaism from history into some orbital metaphysical vision? This is why I called the Temple Mount the end point of Zionism. That's when Zionism meets its messianic and historical end. If the Temple Mount is realized the same way that the Jewish sovereignty was realized over the rest of the land of Israel, it will actually flip the table and make Zionism into some, you know,
this puts me in mind of the title of one of your essays, right? When one of your essays, when you wrote the Temple Mount, that which Zionism can't live with and can't live without.
Yes, exactly.
Well, thank you, Tomer, so much. This was just a great seminar and a wonderful crescendo to our year-long seminars in Israel studies. So this couldn't.
Thank you for inviting me, Yehuda.
Sorts of ways. Thank you, students, colleagues, friends who've joined up. Professor Sarna, would you like to say something to close this year's seminars? No? Wait, please. Can you?
I'm happy to thank everybody for joining us. Many of you see that we took lemons in the sense of the unfortunate fact that we couldn't come together, and we turned them into lemonade by extending our reach much beyond the usual seminars. I'm really grateful to the many who took the time, and I hope we'll see you both in person and virtually next year. I also want to take a moment to thank Professor Mirsky, who has organized and chaired this seminar so successfully, and join in thanking Tomer Persico. Thanks.
Right, and my profoundest thanks once again to Anna, Teresa, to Wendy for making all of this possible the entire year through. Thank you all very, very much, and take good care of yourselves. And hope to see you again before long.